afternoon and a very warm welcome to the InspireOne 2017 webinar series. My name is Neeta and I would be co-facilitating this webinar along with Kouma. But before the introductions, may I take a moment to introduce you to a few things. In order to make this webinar a co-learning and sharing opportunity, we can use the text chat features at all times during the webinar. For minimal disturbances during the webinar, we would request you to keep your lines on mute, and there will be a dedicated question and answer session during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Hence, we encourage you to send your questions as you have them. We will take these up in the Q&A session. In case we are unable to answer your queries, we will certainly get back to you with our responses. Let me start by introducing myself and InspireOne to you, and then I'll request Nick to do the same, post which we will run through the agenda that we want to cover and right away get into the content of the webinar. My name is Neeta Mohla. I head the leadership practice at InspireOne. In my several years of work experience, there are times when I have felt that some solutions that we offer have the propensity to address complex, deep-rooted, and all-encompassing issues that organizations face. And Talent Framework, in fact, is one such solution. So it is indeed my great pleasure to bring this know-how to you today. Let me also quickly introduce InspireOne to you. InspireOne is an organization in the space of learning and development consulting solutions. This includes services and solutions like enhancing productivity and service culture, in partnership with TMI. We also offer development of sales skills and sales solutions through our partnership with TAC, and leadership solutions, engagement surveys and assessments and talent framework through our partnership with IBM. Our objective at InspireOne is, for example, if we look at today's webinar, we get researched and updated know-how which is current and contemporary from IBM. And we are able to then offer organizations opportunities of implementing these through processes like consulting, customization, training, etc. In fact, in the past 17 years, InspireOne has successfully supported many businesses across industry segments through multiple solutions using the processes that we've just mentioned, and enabling them to turn their most important assets, their people, into more productive and more efficient resources. Let me now ask Nick to introduce himself and IBM. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Neeta. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this webinar. As Neeta mentioned, my name is Nick Kouma, and I'm leading the IBM Talent Management business across Asia Pacific. I spent the last 10 years or so working in this space. Previously, before with Mohla, when it comes to HR. And that simple answer is actually, IBM's been in that space for quite some time now, but in 2012, purchased the organization Kenexa that I was working with. And so that's how we got into that. Today, we're very happy and fortunate to be working alongside of InspireOne as a valued business partner, and we'll showcase some of how InspireOne are using a bit of our research and content to accelerate business value, especially for folks like yourselves. From a broader picture, though, in terms of what IBM Talent Management does, we're here to support organizations when it comes to broader talent acquisition, finding and hiring the right people for changing businesses, creating ways to engage and develop talent, and then broadly looking at how cognitive computing is disrupting HR. So I'm excited today to share just a little bit around our research and how it's applicable to folks like yourselves, especially in the talent framework space. Thanks, Neeta.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. So let me introduce the agenda for the day for our participants. What we will cover is the following. We will start with understanding the strategic need for a talent infrastructure, and I think this is really important because this really then sets the context for how we really apply it and we use it in our organizations. We will then take real case examples. So we will take two case examples to see how talent frameworks were used to improve HR processes like talent development and performance management and engagement. And finally, we will look at the Indian context of where we are at with this talent framework solution, and we will share, what we have done with respect to this in India. At the outset, I just want to also mention that we would be taking a longer time in the first item of the agenda, mainly because of the rich content we want you to get acquainted with. But by no means does this mean that you will need to read every slide completely. We will ensure that the slide deck for this webinar is sent to you soon after the webinar is over so that you can look at the content in more detail at your own time. Right. So, Nick, we'll start with the strategic need for the talent framework, and what I would like to really, look at is a question that really comes to everybody's mind when we think of a talent infrastructure or a talent framework, which is why is this really required? In fact, if I was to turn the question around a little bit, what kind of business challenges would get addressed through the talent framework, Nick?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Neeta. And maybe we just take this from a broader sort of high-level view first, and then we'll start to narrow down into very specific examples. But by and large, think about organizations that are going through either planned or even unplanned, but relatively significant change. An example could be organic growth, or maybe a merger or an acquisition. These organizations are going through that change and need to find a way to plan and map their workforce in a manner which is conducive for success in the future. And so by having this planned and mapped out, organizations are able to ensure that they have the right skills in place. If they're going through an acquisition, as an example, they don't necessarily have a clear plan in place prior to that acquisition on how to address redundant skills or overlapping workforce. By having this mapped out, an organization can plan for exactly that change. And so it allows for individuals to maybe be repurposed or possibly grow and develop into new roles by having talent frameworks, by having all of this taxonomy clearly defined. Now, when we think about this in more of an HR context and familiar processes, on the next slide, you'll see actually some very specific examples and some business needs or challenges that talent frameworks can address. So in the realms of performance management, succession and career planning, compensation management, assessments, or even staffing and recruiting. Take, for example, again, this organization which is going through an acquisition. How do you ensure that as you start to grow as this newly formed company, the people you're bringing into your organization are those which align with the new business strategy? After an acquisition, undoubtedly the business strategy is going to change or at the very least be accelerated. How do you ensure that you're bringing the people into your company that have the right skill sets, are able to fluidly move across the organization, and ultimately become high performers or key contributors? So with talent frameworks, it provides, even at the recruiter level, interview questions that recruiters should be asking down to an individual job, or in recruitment speak, an individual requisition, allowing them to focus on bringing the right people in for the job at the right time. As we go through some of the case studies and later on in the segment, we'll specifically address how talent frameworks is going to be supportive for performance management, talent development, and driving employee engagement. So I won't go into too much detail on those at this moment, but we'll give some live examples on how that actually drove business outcomes in those cases. So by and large, when you think about this, why is a talent framework useful? It's for organizations that are planning for growth or are subject to change because of market influences. and it allows for business leaders to act quickly because the planning is already in place.
Sure, Nick. And in fact, of course, this is really relevant, but at the very least, every HR function is faced with the challenge today about improving productivity, improving engagement. So these are really everyday challenges. And without a good infrastructure, it becomes difficult to measure any kind of movement in these areas. And also, if I really look at the next slide, if you're looking at the context from India's perspective, we are expecting hiring to go up by 76% in 2017. We're also expecting that in 2017, 90% of the organizations will feel that their talent is the number one priority in their organizations. So to have the right talent and to have the right talent engaged will be very, very critical. And also there is another global statistics here which talks about the fact that 90% of organizations around the globe believe that they do not have the skills for the future. So this is going to be a big need, a big requirement, and definitely talent framework could be one solution for this. So I would like to really go into a little bit more depth in understanding what really is the IBM Talent Framework. Uh, so, uh, so let me just start by explaining this in a very simple way. It's a job-based specific competency model. And by that, what it means is for any specific job within the 21 industry segments and for the general corporate function, if we are trying to address what is the job description all about, what is the description of the job, what does the role really entail, what are the key responsibilities, what are the competencies that are required, and these competencies could be foundational, functional, technical, managerial, or even leadership. And then basically these competencies, defining them in terms of proficiency levels and being able to use these proficiency levels or these definitions of competencies in all the HR processes is really what the talent framework does. So really, if you look at it, it is a really extensive and exhaustive library, if you like, of content which is based on over 30 years of research, and it provides organizations a clearly defined roles and skills which they would need to understand and be able to then define what good really looks like for each role. Not only that, because it defines what good looks like, the expected level of performance for a role also becomes absolutely clear. Now, I want to take this through by using an example, and since I'm assuming that most of our audience is from HR, I would like to take an example of a compensation and benefits manager in any organization. So if we go to the next slide, here we are seeing a description of what really the role is all about. So the job definition, the key responsibilities, the 4 key responsibilities, and the scope of the job clearly defined. And also what we have is a band level. So for example, if we say this is job band 3, what this really means is that we're looking at this person's competence not only from a job family vertical perspective, but we are also mapping it to the level of the role within an organization. So here, if we really look at the framework, it defines levels in terms of 6 different levels. So the first level, level 1, is really your executive management, going down to level 6, which is a technician or a trainee or an administrator. So clearly for this particular job, what we are saying is that this job is within the band 3 of the levels of hierarchy within the organization. So it is a functional or a technical or a process leadership role, which is what we are really looking at. So that's looking at both the extent of the vertical depth of the role, but also then mapping it to the levels within the organization. Further to this, if we go into this a little bit more, now we're looking at one example here of a technical competence. So this is, let's say, of a compensation management. So this this particular competency, for example, is required at a level 2, which is working experience, and the extent to which it is required is also stated here. So it is medium. Now we'll just go into the next slide to understand how extensive this is. So as we defined earlier, what we needed was a working experience. This is level 2. And for each competency, hence you can see that you have statements looking at 4 different proficiency levels of that competencies. And these statements are really action oriented statements. So it becomes very easy to either map the competencies, to measure the competencies, to see how all the HR processes are linked to it, what the next level of proficiency means in case you have to develop this person. So it is absolutely clear looking at these levels and mapping it to the extent to which you require it. The proficiency levels, really being able to do that, and all that organizations really need to do therefore is to see how this then can get customized into their work culture. So for example, there may be a little bit of a change required in terms of, do we require it at level 2 or level 3? So that's a customization that can be made. Customization can also be made with respect to a few sentences and to make sure that the proficiency level is actually capturing what is required of that role. And hence what we really look at is there is a huge amount of time that can be saved in not having to write this really lengthy content. The content is all available. All that the organizations then need to do is to map it to their culture, and actually it's ready to use, so to speak. In fact, what we believe is it takes more than 40 hours to write a content for any one job, and this part is already provided by the framework. Moving on, we can then see how this competency is mapped or linked to a number of learning references, also to the development statements, which become very clear and robust inputs into any IDP creation. Also, we see how the competency is linked to coaching as a, in case coaching is required. So what are the tips and how is it that you can really coach for this competency? And also for talent acquisition, in case, you're looking at recruitment, what are the kind of questions you need to ask in order for you to assess this particular competency from a prospective candidate. So really overall, if we really summarize this, it's an extensive library, it's an updated library. It includes the job descriptions, the descriptors, the competencies, all competencies that are required. The competencies are described in 4 proficiency levels, and hence it is something that is really ready to use for organizations. Now, I think that this is an extremely comprehensive, exhaustive library, Nick, but maybe we should also try and contrast it with competency models that organizations already have. So if we look at competency models that organizations have and this talent framework, may I ask you to also help us understand what is the difference between the two?
That's a really good question, Neeta. Thanks so much for that. When we think about comparing and contrasting with the traditional competency framework, a lot of individuals, a lot of HR practitioners very specifically think about leadership behavioral frameworks, something which is maintained at the top of an organization, not necessarily something which is driven down into the lowest levels of a company. What we're talking about today is something which is significantly deeper, significantly more competencies, or taxonomies of knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes required for the successful performance of jobs in an organization, both now and in the future. This can include any type of requirements for workers, such as their knowledge, skills, education, experiences, as well as any personal characteristics of that worker, like cognitive abilities, traits, interests. When we think about talent frameworks, it does significantly more, and we start to step into the realm around job definitions, interview questions, coaching tips, behavioral and proficiency descriptors, creation of SMART goals, and by SMART I mean specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, and learning references. The learning references, and a lot of this here was just showcased by Neeta. She did a great job of talking through compensation manager within an organization. That's something that maybe some of you on the line have actually benefits. And so this is something that effectively is providing resources, however, not only centrally to HR, but then also into the hands of the people who are most in need of it, employees and managers. Now we think about, for example, those learning preferences. That's crucial for a worker, for an individual to understand what is required to grow and develop into a new job, or to create a career path, a successful career path for themselves. And so it's doing significantly more than what most individuals would think of around a behavioral framework. It's much deeper than the top line of an organization. It's cutting across all different types of job functions as well as job levels. When we think about what makes it unique, maybe on the next slide, we can dive into that in a little bit more detail. There's really 4 key takeaways that I'd like you to walk away with on this aspect, around it being ready for deployment, around it being agnostic when it comes to the application or the software through which people access it, the fact that it's providing significant time and cost savings, and ultimately it's driving a deeper understanding of the organization. Think about organizational knowledge. In terms of ready for deployment, Neeta at best, it's something which is ready to go, and it's saving a significant amount of time, by the way. It can be simply picked up. It's based on 30 years of research, and it can be broken either down to an individual job function, like a sales function, or it can be applied across an entire organization. And if you think about the nature of some companies, whether they're a large sort of multinational conglomerate organization or very much a focused national company, both are relevant, and both are definitely possible. And so it's ready for deployment based on 30 years of research. In terms of application, and for this especially think of software through which people access this content, I can't stress enough that it is software agnostic. And by that I mean, if you have an existing technology in place today where this content could be accessed, that's absolutely fine. It's very much oriented toward ensuring that it's placed into the hands of the individuals who need it most, both HR and then also the frontline and managers, and ensuring that it's accessible to them in a simple, intuitive, and in many cases familiar manner. Now, if you're a growing organization and you don't have software in place, that's okay too. The combination of IBM and InspireOne, we definitely have something that we could provide to you as well. So the key focus here around application is really around accessibility. In order for this to become a meaningful or a useful piece of content, it needs to be put into the hands of those people who require it most. So I can't stress enough that purchasing the content or developing the content even internally isn't enough. It needs to be deployed, it needs to be made accessible. So ready for deployment, application, time and cost savings. Again, Neeta had mentioned it. When we think about writing just for one individual job title, on average, we're seeing across the industry that it takes around 40 hours. That's a lot of time which is focused toward relatively tactical and already completed tasks. And so we're here to support when it comes to streamlining, making it so that you can focus your efforts toward more strategic imperatives, ensuring that this is something which is deployed across the organization, made into business as usual, and is meaningful for those people who need it most. That's really the key focus of where you should be investing your time and effort. And if you need help, of course, InspireOne is there to help you as well. And then lastly, a deeper understanding when we think about organizational knowledge. By and large today, we're faced with quite a shift when it comes to not only digital disruption, but more specifically cognitive disruption. And being enabled and prepared for these disruptions, these disruptors, is crucial. So understanding the type of skills you have within your workforce will ensure that you're poised and ready for tomorrow, poised and ready for the future, ready to address this type of digital and cognitive disruption. And so these are some of the unique factors around that. When we think about how this is actually driving business results, we're going to really start stepping into that now. But just putting this up on the screen, some of the key areas would be around driving quality of hire, employee productivity, or reducing staff turnover and recruiting costs. I mentioned the example a couple of times now. If you think about an organization which is going through an acquisition and they are now faced with growth, they're accelerating through and beyond that acquisition, bringing people into the company is a key consideration. If you already have the needed skills internally and you simply need to encourage a more fluid workforce, then reduction of recruiting costs starts to become quite tangible, quite significant, and very much recognizable for a lot of the people on this phone. And you guys are experts when it comes to these topics. Another consideration is through our research, we've seen that it has a significant impact on improving learning across an organization. And we'll get into some of those examples, but by and large, that improvement on learning is simply down to the fact that employees or individual workers, it starts to become clear to them what is exactly required of them to do their job successfully. And then they start to pace themselves when it comes to growth and development, and to become a bit more ready to take that next step for their career.
Right, Nick. And obviously it has a huge impact on reducing costs and improving productivity and efficiency. But I'm also just wondering, have you seen impact on, measures like, for example, operational efficiency or ROI as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we can reflect back even just on the simple example, and it's a continued extreme example, but we live in a world of extremes, and it's a lot easier to relate to this. With the example of an organization that's gone through an acquisition, often acquisitions, you're faced with overlapping skills within, for example, shared functions like HR, or looking at sales, or even just operations themselves. And ensuring that you understand the composition of your workforce, and providing the redundant individuals a clear path internally to find a role which is most suitable for them. And that creates operational efficiencies in itself. It allows for a more streamlined acquisition strategy. So when we start to think about how the HR strategy supports a broader business strategy, this is one sort of easy example that many people have gone through. Either their company has been acquired, or they have been on the other end of on the other side of the table, where they were the acquiring company, and making sure that there's a streamlined plan to very specifically manage the workforce. That's a key consideration.
Right, Nick.
That's a good question.
Right. Thank you so much for that, because what if I was to just summarize the key points that you made, I think it's a very significant point that organizations do have competency models. But what happens with these models is that it's at a very high level, and then to take it to each particular job becomes a really difficult task to do. And organizations that have tried to do it have really struggled, because it becomes too complex and kind of falls off, because it becomes too difficult to manage. So having something which is ready made and then using it obviously helps to solve that issue. And I think the second point that you're making is the impact of this in several processes, which is really important. And of course, 189% improvement in learning is really significant. So maybe let's just take some real examples to see how this has happened. And we're moving now into the second item of our agenda, which is to look at real case examples of how IBM Talent Frameworks have enabled talent development and also performance management and engagement. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you again to take us through some of these case studies and share your experiences, please.
Sure, absolutely. I'm very happy to. So we have two examples. These are two very specific customers that IBM has had the pleasure to work with over the years. We'll start with the manufacturing organization, which really needed to drive talent development across the company. And they had phrased talent development, a talent development initiative called Command Leadership. This Command Leadership program was oriented toward driving skills, capability, and developing the workforce to be ready for future challenges. When we think about market shift and when we think about the impact that automation has in the manufacturing space, this was a key consideration, ensuring that the workforce is adapting and learning alongside of technology shift was one of their key challenges. And so with the launch of the Command Leadership Program, this company with 25,000 people in the manufacturing sector, they started simple and started small, focusing on the IT function, and then identified two key job families around repair and maintenance staff, which are similar but not exactly the same. So really this was a rollout focused on three different areas: IT, repair, and maintenance staff. These roles were identified as the ones that were going to have the most significant impact in embracing and addressing challenges and change when it comes to technology disruption. And so we worked with them to deploy talent frameworks across the organization, using a combination of their existing software as well as the deployment of our own proprietary software called Skills Manager. And it allowed for the company to monitor the rollout, but most importantly, put into the hands of those individuals across those three areas the needed content to learn, grow, and develop, especially, and I can't stress this enough, when thinking about technology disruption for manufacturing. And so this was one of the key considerations for them. It was a success in their view because they started in an area where they knew that adoption would be high. The IT function is often usually the testing ground for concepts that are new, and so by rolling this out across IT and then their two key job families, they sort of had a notion that this would be a predetermined success, which ultimately allowed them to then consider and eventually roll it out to the entire company. And so, that was one of their key wins, one of their key outcomes or learnings was that by starting simple and small and in a way which has a measurable outcome or a predetermined measurable outcome, they were able to get the buy-in that was needed. Stakeholder management for this type of introduction of content is crucial. One of the other considerations was they realized how quick this was for their deployment. They had a very, very tight timeline, and they were actually considering more traditional routes of either using internal resources to write this content on their own, or to deploy an organization which is focused on change management to do a lot of custom writing for them. And both of them had quite a significant timeline. With this being something which is tried and tested over 30 years of research, they felt that it was exactly the right fit, especially given their timeline. And so they were able to save, especially when it comes to that time, and have the HR function and focus on adoption and creating awareness. So that's one example around the global manufacturing company and how they used it for talent development to ensure that they were getting ready for future challenges. When we think about another example, which is slightly different, we'll shift over into a different sector entirely with the financial services sector. We worked with an organization, and you'll see that on the next slide. We worked with an organization that employed 60,000 people, and it was absolutely useful when it comes to driving performance management initiatives. The company came to us and they said, we've actually grown quite significantly. We've reached the point of 60,000 people, 60,000 people. And we now have 7,000 roles defined across our organization, to the point where it's extremely difficult for us to plan when it comes to performance management, when it comes to succession planning. Our points of comparability are a bit weak, or they're spread out, it's disparate. We have a challenge when it comes to uniformly assessing our organization. And so by deploying talent frameworks, we were able to help them map those 7,000 roles into 300 roles. roles. Now, this created some great points of consistency for the company in terms of growth, but more importantly for them in terms of managing their organization, in terms of having larger talent pools to understand where high performance actually is within roles versus where it is not, determining which skills are transferable to ensure for a fluid workforce. Again, this organization had grown quite significantly, and so trading of talent was a rather rampant behavior. It was part of their culture. Having people shift from one team to the next was a part of their DNA. And so it allowed for them to have this clearly mapped out where people actually fit within the company and whether or not they were suitable for another role, whether it was something that management requested or whether or not it was the individual pathing out their own career on their own. One of the secondary outcomes, which we were interested in and we were delighted to see, was that in pockets of the organization, there was actually a significant increase in employee engagement. And this is, and we happen to be doing their employee engagement survey for them as well. This was a result of the fact that one of their key drivers of engagement was around having clear expectations set by the company from the company to the individual in terms of what they would need to do to be successful in their role. Additionally, having a clear path for their own growth and development was another driver of employee engagement. Those areas of the organization that had the strongest adoption and awareness around talent frameworks, its usefulness, and the broad application had significant increases in employee engagement levels. Now, many of you know employee engagement is very strongly correlated to business outcomes, and so this company was quite pleased to see this as a result. And so, directly they had launched this program to support when it comes to performance management, but then indirectly it also was driving business outcomes via improvements on employee engagement levels. And so that's a second example around a large-scale global financial services company and how it was used to drive employee engagement and to clean up their performance management processes.
Nick, thank you so much. I can't help thinking enough that when there is clarity around jobs, there's clarity around roles, there are clear measures, of success clearly identified, it gives so much control to everyone, whether it is the employee, whether it is the manager, whether it is the HR. So it's really, really important and critical from that standpoint. But I'm just wondering that the examples that we've taken so far, we've looked at large organizations with 60,000 and 25,000 employees. What happens if there is a smaller company? How does a smaller company sort of get started with using talent frameworks?
That's a really good question, Neeta. And you're right. The examples that I chose to share today were rather large organizations that had very ambitious plans. And I sort of said it before, actually, around how we can get started with this and the applications that it can be used for. If we start simple and start small and determine measurable outcomes, this is going to be a success. And the one key consideration here is it doesn't need to be rolled out to an entire organization or to a large organization for it to be a success. It can be segmented down to an individual function like shared services or HR or IT or marketing. It can be broken down to a sales function, and it doesn't need to be deployed to a large-scale organization. So it's not only scalable in terms of building up, but also breaking down. And that absolutely is definitely a key consideration. These organizations that are growing, they all start somewhere. And so it doesn't mean that everybody is just sitting in an organization with 25 or 60,000 people. And so that's a fair question. And it's something that can be applied for small organizations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that brings us to the third item on the agenda, which is really looking at what is it that we've done here in India and how is an Indian company using the talent framework. And very correctly, as you said, and I'll just explain this case through this case example, that this is actually a large, very large, again, very large organization in the manufacturing sphere. And what they realized is that while they had the leadership competencies defined as per proficiency levels and mapped to roles, what they didn't have in place were the technical competencies required for so many jobs and roles within the manufacturing part and the plant part of their business. And so it secluded so many people from really being able to, grow, develop, uh, for them to get the right talent and so on and so forth. So what they were looking for is, is there something that is available which helps to define what these roles really need? So what are the definitions they still had in some sort of format of, that they could use, but they certainly didn't have the technical competencies, functional competencies in place. So what they did was, and which is what you alluded to earlier, they didn't go through the entire, they didn't sort of buy all the frameworks and use it across the organization. But what they did was they bought the manufacturing framework. So for the technical roles, and what they did with that was, so once they bought this, they had to then apply it or customize it for their critical roles. And what we did for them through an enablement workshop was to help them understand how they could do so. So they took the framework, they looked at critical roles within their manufacturing and technical functions. Once those roles were identified, they learned through the enablement workshop as to how they can really go about customizing it. And now at least what they had in place was, and that's how they started, because they just started some months back. For some technical roles, they are absolutely clear about the competencies, both leadership and technical competencies, and they know that it is a very robust process that they have followed. What they are planning to do now is to take up more roles, so they're doing it step by step, so that slowly within the technical and manufacturing functions, all the roles are completed. So they've isolated families, job families, they've isolated roles that they're going to work with going forward. And of course, here the outcomes expected is not what has happened. These are the benchmarks, and they will be working somewhere towards this. But it is just to state and to reiterate your point that you made earlier, that you don't have to start, in a very complex way. You can take a small portion, a small part, get familiar, know how to use it, develop the competence of doing so, and then slowly take it across the organization. So that's the Indian experience. And Nick, one thing that would be interesting for all of us to know is that in your experience, when you worked with these frameworks, what has been the learning? So are there situations that we should watch out for? Are there times where we should not think of using it, because otherwise it's a no-brainer?
Good question. I recently met with a customer who had partnered with us on Talent Frameworks a little over a year ago. And we were just checking in to see how it was going. And they expressed frustrations around adoption, around it being used. And then as we started to sort of peek behind the curtain, we realized that it wasn't properly embedded into existing systems or applications, and it wasn't made accessible to the people who needed it. It was actually held quite centrally within the HR function, the content was, and it wasn't distilled down into the organization. This sort of approach would be like owning a library of books, extremely beautiful knowledge and insights, but then locking the doors and making it so nobody can go in. That's what you absolutely want to avoid. You need to make sure that the doors are unlocked, that you're encouraging people to come in and visit, that you're not telling them they need the entire library, but just a few books off the shelf. Now that's exactly what Talent Frameworks is. Each individual stakeholder is going to have a vested interest in a small piece or a specific portion of the content. And so, the most useful thing you can do is unlock the doors, make it so that it is available in existing software, or if you need a software get one, make it so that individuals can actually access the content. Otherwise, it's simply just held within the hands of people who can't necessarily drive the change. So make it accessible. That's one of the key learnings, and it's relatively consistent. In order for this to actually have a change and to bring business value, it needs to be accessible across the board.
Right, Nick. And we're getting a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to start with the questions now. One of the questions that has come up, and I think you mentioned this word cognitive earlier. So the question really is that if you're looking at the world of digital and cognitive disruption, what is it? What is the connect of talent frameworks there?
That's a really big question. Okay, and actually, okay, so the way Talent Frameworks is helping drive cognitive. Maybe just a couple points on cognitive first, and how IBM actually defines cognitive or AI. We view it as augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, like Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking, where Stephen Hawking is saying AI will be the death of humanity within 100 years. Absolutely not. We're thinking about augmented intelligence, an extension of human expertise. Another point is that when it comes to cognitive, end users or consumers are predicted, 1 and 2 consumers are predicted to have daily interaction with cognitive within the next 2 years, some form of cognitive application. Daily interaction, 1 and 2 consumers globally. And so when we think about a shifting landscape, a lot of people, they would have to really think whether or not they've touched any cognitive today, this week, this month, or even this year. But within 2 years from now, every second person you meet will say that they've had an interaction with that. And so there alone, we're looking at quite a shift in terms of how people are presented with scenarios, the type of experience they have, because cognitive is focused on an individual experience, not just a uniform sort of standardized experience. And so talent frameworks really are the building blocks of a company, which would work alongside of, for example, an HR information system. It's the building blocks of an organization to understand the composition of your workforce. That way you can provide an individual experience to each individual employee, the cognitive approach. And so talent frameworks, it's sort of the first step when you think about embracing cognitive for your company. Cognitive, especially when it comes to HR processes, operational considerations. These talent frameworks, these building blocks need to be in place for that. Cognitive in combination with talent frameworks are going to have a very direct impact on talent acquisition, learning, and also on workforce analytics.
Right, Nick. So there's another question that has just come in, which is the following. So, so the question says that as a foundation, we have a competency framework, but we are yet to define the proficiency levels. Could you share an approach? So I'm just going to try and answer this question from our experience, and then I'll also invite you, Nick, to just add on. So one, of course, just defining the competencies in itself definitely is not enough, because then you have no measures. So the proficiency levels really help you to put measures to your competencies. And proficiency levels really build on behavioral statements that have impact at different extents depending upon the proficiency level itself. So I think what it really requires, is of course a good understanding of the behavior and what the behavior means. But then to be able to put proficiency levels to it, I think what is also important is to understand how one behavioral statement or statements will be different from the next set. Because definitely at the next proficiency level, the impact has to be higher and so on. Now the way we've done it is, of course, we've used the high performance behavior. This is another Kenexa tool that we have. And we're trained on really understanding the content, which is one, and how the behaviors are very discrete in the different levels. So we are able to use that knowledge, and of course you have to work deeply with the organization then to define the proficiency levels, because organizations also have their own strategy and their own way of looking at these behaviors. So I don't know how to answer this in a simple way, but what I do know is that it requires a little bit of, I would say, expert knowledge. But I don't think any expert also can define it on their own. I guess it's a combination of using the expert knowledge and working with the organizations to really look at how you can create the proficiency levels for the competencies. Uh, Over to you, Nick. Would you like to add?
Neeta, we've worked together for so many years now that your answer took most of what I would say. The only thing I would add to that would be when we think about process, and as you start to embark on defining proficiency levels, but definitely start with an area where it will have the most significant impact on business outcomes. Often people are thinking about a sales function, for example, because the metrics are quite measurable. If you're able to start in an area of the organization, deploy that, roll it out, to get it so that it's embedded into business practice, and then measure your success and try and replicate as well as learn from it. And that's the only piece I would add around simplifying the task. Your organization could be extremely large, or it could also be sort of a growing organization at its infancy. Either way, start with the focus when it comes to taking on that type of task. That's the only thing I would add to what you said, Neeta.
Right. Nick, there's another question which, in fact, I would like you to address, which is around the softwares required. Because, if it's a large organization, you have the content all there, but how do you deploy it using software? And I know you said that it's software agnostic, but could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And this could be part of the somewhat laborious task, but organizations that are using maybe an SAP for performance management, maybe using an Oracle for recruitment software, and maybe using IBM Kenexa when we're thinking about skills management, the skills manager software that I had mentioned before. Each of those different streams within the HR function serve a different purpose. And so the talent frameworks content, not all of it will be relevant within each of those streams. So within recruitment, we would look at embedding the interview questions into the recruiter portal within Oracle, for example, just to make it so that it's tied to each job requisition, as well as, of course, tidying of the jobs themselves, like the example I gave, distilling 7,000 roles down to 300. So, there's different considerations for recruitment. For performance management, we have a SMART goal creation, we have considerations around learning references, growth and development, as well as coaching tips for managers who are approaching this task. And so making that particular content accessible within SuccessFactors is crucial. And then when it comes to larger planning for the organization, Skills Manager, the IBM solution is also a good one, which can be used especially from the HR function view when we think about ensuring that you're building a workforce which is a bit more fluid. And so I hope that addressed the question. It's definitely one of the biggest considerations, so I'm glad you asked the question.
Right. And I can just link back to the experience that we're having with our Indian client. As of now, they haven't taken the software. They will eventually, but what they want to do is approach it step by step, which is possibly, an answer to a question that we've also received. That why is it that the Indian case, the implementation in the Indian case is different from the other global cases? And really, what I want to just share my thoughts on this particular question is the following. The talent frameworks in India is still new, and I think this organization took this on because they really realized the value, and of course they were looking for something like this, and when they found it, they knew the value of it immediately. But in any organization, and this is a large organization, there are several initiatives running at the same time. So while this is very critical, they are not able to completely do away with the other initiatives. And so what they realized is that they need to take this on, but they need to take this on step by step and look at it from a longer term perspective. And hence, for them, it was important to start small, but to show success and then slowly start looking at this in a more, progressive and a holistic way. Perhaps that is one of the differences, that I see in the way the Indian company has implemented it, and possibly the implementation, the cases that you discussed, Nick. I'm assuming that, one factor which is important for organizations to consider is that, and I'm sure all organizations anyways are running several initiatives at the same time. So what is it that they can handle and what is it that they can handle well is a question that they would need to consider. So would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and it sounds like you addressed the question quite thoroughly in terms of what they can handle and what they can handle well. You're absolutely right. Take that into consideration. Internally, you're going to have a very specific set of skills across the HR function when it comes to deploying this, as well as having accessibility to those people who could possibly roll this out. And so, there's a variety of different approaches when it comes to driving adoption. There's the approach where you can work using all internal resources and you just simply need the content. There's other approaches where you can actually partner with the likes of an InspireOne or an IBM to help carry out a lot of that change for you. And so, there's definitely considerations, like Neeta was saying, around what you're able to do versus what you're not.
Right, and possibly, Nick, we have time for just one last question. And what I would just like to say to the participants is thank you very much. There are a lot more questions that we may not have had time to address, but we will certainly be getting back to you with our answers to that. But I'll just take this last question. We have a minute or so for this webinar, which is about how can we implement the talent framework in a manufacturing industry. So I think this is really bang on. We do have a manufacturing talent framework which is suited for the manufacturing industry itself. I don't have the details of the number of roles and the job families that this addresses, but we can definitely connect with you offline to show you how extensive and detailed this is. And this is really something which is, very easy to do because you have the talent framework. You need to, once you have that, all you need to do is to see how you want to implement it either in your critical roles or across certain job families or across certain levels. So certainly we will get back to you and address your question in more detail. But I would like to take this time now to thank everybody for their participation, for their questions, and for their interest. Thank you all very much.